Now, if you're watching this brief lecture before or after 13th, it makes no difference. But what I wanted to do is to show you or provide you some data to put some of the documentary into context. And some of this stuff is mentioned in the documentary, but I want to also provide a little bit of data. Um, as I said before, in the documentary clearly shows, we've had this tremendous increase in incarceration in this country during the past, I'd say, 30 years. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at our incarceration rates, they don't really fit with our crime rates. So here is a graph from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports showing that violent crime peaked in 1994 and has been declining ever since, and yet our incarceration rates continue to climb, despite this decrease. Also, if you take some other measures, for example, murders, not just any violent crime, but homicides, you see that the murder rate from about 1974 through 94 was consistently high, but you see a tremendous drop-off from about 1995, 94, 95 on down. Again, and yet our incarceration rates are going up. I know that we talk a lot about, Chicago being the murder city of the United States and talking about all these violent gun deaths. But if you actually look at the numbers, I know the numbers are still way too high. For example, in Chicago, 473 murder and non-negligent manslaughter cases in 2015. However, look at in 1990, that was almost doubled. Okay, and that is the same is true for virtually every single major city in the United States. The crime rate the murder rate has actually gone down. Look in Los Angeles. The peak year was 1992 with 1,094 deaths in 1992, and in 2015 it was 283. So what's going on? What's going on is that while we're having a very huge decrease in violent crime, there has been a tremendous increase in arrests for drug crimes. So drug abuse violation arrests, you can see, they didn't start going down in 1994 or 95. In fact, they've been climbing ever since. And the question is, why is this happening? Is it because our population has stopped killing each other and doing drugs instead? That's probably not the case. What's rather happening, if you look at here, at the arrests for possession versus sales. When I think of a drug criminal, the ones that I'm most concerned about is people who are selling or manufacturing drugs. And you can see here in this chart that the sales and manufacturing of drugs hasn't really climbed significantly here in terms of arrests. So about the same people are being arrested for sales and manufacture of drugs. But what you see an explosion of is this arrest for possession of drugs. So what we're doing is we're criminalizing possession over the years more so than we have done before. And so the percentage of people who are incarcerated because of a drug crime has been increasing quite steadily since the 1990s. Okay? It's interesting too, just in terms of a health crisis. When we think of drug crimes, often we think of things like, you read in the paper that somebody was caught with marijuana, they were caught with cocaine. But if you look at the actual causes of preventable deaths in the United States, when you look at drugs, you see that prescription or pharmaceutical deaths way outnumber any kind of other issues. So this is a chart that comes from 2010, and this is coming from the CDC. And basically, you see here that here's the percentage, the number of causes of death, prescription opioid pain reliever overdoses right here, other pharmaceutical drug overdoses here. And if you put them together down here, the total pharmaceutical deaths, you see that pharmaceutical deaths outnumber fatal car crashes and firearms deaths in this country. And yet that's not even something that's part of our criminal justice system. And in fact, this is really thought of as more of a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, which sort of begs the question or makes you think about, well, why are not some of these other drugs being treated as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue? And again, I can't explain why this has happened, but it has happened. Okay. So I also want to show you a little bit of data in terms of racial disparities. There has been a lot of talk, I'd say, during the past 8 or 9 years about the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And that's what 13th is all about. And I know that they are really forceful in what they're talking about, but let's look at some of the data here, okay? So in terms of drug use, if you go to the data and look at drug use, this is the National Survey on Drug Use, and let's pick heroin, okay? And so here what I can do is look at race and ethnicity. Have you ever used heroin? And I can create this nice little graph. Anybody can do this. What you see when you look at this graph, here are African Americans, and here are white Americans, Native, Hawaiian, Asian, more than one race, and Hispanic. And this red bar is the number of people who indicate that they've never used heroin. And the blue is that they have. What you see here is that the use for Black and white Americans is virtually identical, and Hispanic even a little less, okay, to look at this data. If we go back and let's look at what? Marijuana use, and we do the same thing by race. Again, we see that virtually identical reports of drug use by whites, Blacks, Hispanic, and you see that typically you see that more Asian people report having never used a drug, but other than that, there's really not these striking racial or ethnic differences. Let's take a look at cocaine. Cocaine by race and ethnicity. Here you see that it's actually white Americans who indicate that they have tried cocaine. So they're, as a group, more likely to indicate that they have. Also Native Americans, okay? Which is interesting. But if we go back and we look at crack cocaine, which is essentially exactly the same drug, just in a different form, even that you see not a whole lot of racial differences, although you do see African Americans slightly more indicating that they had tried crack. Basically, the point I'm trying to make with these tables is that, you know, if you look at virtually every drug, there really aren't any huge ethnic or racial differences in drug use. You see that African Americans, Hispanic, white people use the same drugs at approximately the same frequency. However, if you look at drug arrests and drug incarcerations, you see that African Americans and Hispanic Americans are 3 times more likely than whites to be arrested for a drug crime, arrested and charged with a drug crime. And they're 6 times more likely than whites who are arrested to be incarcerated for that drug crime. So that's where you're seeing the racial disparities. Although you see that the drug use is quite similar, the disparities come in with arrest and then incarceration. And this is what some of the information from 13th is trying to push. And one of the reasons why you might see this disparities might have to do with some of our social policies. So for example, there's a social policy that was started in New York City, which was called Stop and Frisk. And Stop and Frisk was not designed to be a racially charged practice. What it was a sort of a zero tolerance policy to stop anybody that looks suspicious, frisk them, and to try to get the bad guys off the street before they commit crimes. And it might seem on the surface to be like, okay, well, that makes sense. However, if you look at the stop and frisk in practice, what you saw was that 53% of New York City is, in terms of the population, is either African American or Hispanic. So if stop and frisk was truly a random event, you'd see that about 53% of the time an African American or Hispanic person would be stopped and frisked. But however, the data actually shows that it's 85 to 87% of those people who are stopped and frisked were actually African American or Hispanic, which shows that it's not that stop and frisk was a racist policy, but maybe in practice, the people who looked suspicious to officers tended to be more African American or Hispanic, and so in practice, it may have then led to more racist actions. And of course, the studies of stop and frisk find that 87 to 90% of the people who are stopped and frisked by the police officers were actually innocent, had no drugs, nothing. And of course, if you're African American or Hispanic living in New York City, and if you're stopped many times, frisked, and even though you're innocent, you have no drugs, sure, they don't arrest you, but it breeds sort of suspicion and a lack of trust in the police officers and a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. So that's just an example of how a policy that might have been put in place for one reason leads to some other kinds of issues and might have led to more arrests. If you're frisking more African Americans, you're more likely to arrest them. And then once arrested, they're more likely to be incarcerated. So the stop and frisk then might have led to sort of some of these disparities. Now, I just want to show, before I stop, I just want to show you that the disparities don't really end once the person gets to prison. There's a practice that the courts have been looking at pretty carefully these days, is solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is used in every jurisdiction, but some jurisdictions depend on it more than others. And this particular chart shows you the states in which inmates are kept in isolation at least 22 hours a day for 15 days or more. So in other words, not just a simple solitary, but it's being used a lot and it's being used for a long time. And you see that there are huge variations in the states. Louisiana, almost 15% of the prison population is being subjected to this kind of pretty harsh punishment. If we look at Wyoming, I know it's hard for you to see the names of the states, but here's Wyoming right here. Okay. So solitary confinement is something that the courts are looking at. So what does this have to do with racial disparities? Well, let me just show you. If you break down the solitary confinement to the race of the person being confined, you can see very clearly some of the racial disparities that we're talking about here. This particular chart shows, okay, this is the white men who are in solitary confinement. If it goes this way, that means that fewer white men are in solitary than the general prison population. Okay, so if it's black, it suggests that they're being given favors actually, so they're less likely to be put in. And so you see right here, it's not except for 1, 2, 3, 4 places, Tennessee, Maryland, Alaska, and the Bureau of Prisons, do you see more white men in solitary confinement than in the general prison population. However, look at the same data for black and Hispanic men. And what you see is even Wyoming, which I'm sure that Wyoming doesn't have very many African American men in its prison population, they're still more likely to be confined in solitary confinement. And this is that, again, showing that racial disparities are not just seen in arrests, incarceration, but then you continue to see it in the kind of treatment that people receive once they are incarcerated. And so these are the kinds of issues that are being raised in the documentary, and these are the kinds of issues that as Americans that we need to struggle to figure out. It's entirely possible that some of this data is very innocent. It's possible that there are ethnic differences in terms of the kinds of problems that occur while in prison, but you have to look at it and you have to ask the question. Okay? I hope you enjoyed the documentary. It's disturbing, but it's very, very good. Thank you.